to our module on MySQL installation. In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how to install MySQL on a Windows computer and how to verify your installation. And we'll also look at the installation process on a MacBook. Along with learning how to install and verify MySQL, you will also learn the first basic commands to show databases, use a database, show the tables in the database, and select all contents from a table. Before even getting started, you're going to want to consider on what kind of computer you're trying to install MySQL. If you're working with a Windows computer, what operating system version are you using? Hopefully Windows 10 or later, right? Go to Settings, then select System and then About to bring up a screen like this. Here you can see that I'm showing you the installation on a somewhat older 64-bit Windows laptop with 8 GB of RAM that runs Windows 10 Home Edition. You can also see that I have 295 GB of available hard drive space, which should be enough because the requirements are about 4 GB of RAM for MySQL to run comfortably with Workbench, which will mean that my other apps like Word or PowerPoint may run a bit slower, but they'll pick back up if I close Workbench and work with MySQL's much smaller default command client, and that's what I'm going to do from here on out. As you can tell, this laptop is not the newest, not the fastest, so in order to make this video more efficient, I'm showing you screenshots rather than making you sit through my fat fingering as I type or through any periods of waiting for installations to complete. You can install MySQL on a Mac too. To find out which macOS version your computer is running, from the Apple menu in the right corner of your screen, choose About this Mac. In the Overview tab, you should see the macOS name, such as macOS Monterey or macOS Big Sur, followed by its version number, and in the Storage tab, you'll see how much hard drive room you have available. Next, you'll want to know how to access your command line because you're going to need it for an installation. You can do so by either clicking on the Launchpad icon in the dock, typing Terminal in the search field, then clicking Terminal, or by going to the Finder, opening the Applications Utilities folder, and double-clicking on Terminal. And now, feel free to follow along with me installing MySQL on my laptop. To download the installer for MS Windows 10, go to dev.mysql.com, Downloads Installer. This will point you to the download page. Then decide which version, 32 or 64-bit, you would like to install and select the installer, preferably the latest version. The .msi file will download onto your default download directory. Note that these installer files will run on Windows only. The method for installing MySQL on Linux or Mac is different. Now navigate to your default download directory and double-click on the MySQL installer for Windows. This will launch the MySQL installer. Now before you proceed, please make sure that Developer Default is selected. Selecting any of the other options will cause you much more work later in the course. Alright, we've selected the Developer Default. In the most current version as of the making of this video, it will download onto your computer the following. MySQL Server, that's the heart of everything, and nothing goes without SQL Server. MySQL Shell and MySQL Workbench. Those are both fancy versions of the default command line client. We will use the client command line or any of these two tools to send commands to the server. In fact, the Workbench, which we will meet later, is a fine point-and-click interface. The problem with these is that you might not find them in any of the installations that you will meet when you enter the workplace. They take up room and memory that could be allocated otherwise. But most importantly, they open detectable connections into the server, and any unnecessary connection can easily become a vulnerability to the database that hackers are waiting to exploit. Then we have MySQL Router here, which we really won't be using, and MySQL for Visual Studio and MySQL connectors, examples and tutorials, and documentation. We will maybe be using them, maybe not. After you've verified that you have selected developer default, click Next. On the next screen, the installer verifies whether any of the default install directories already exist. Since I just removed an older installation on my computer, you can see that the uninstall process apparently did not delete the old install directory. So this is the installer warning me that everything in that default directory will be overwritten if I decide to continue like this. It also shows me where my executables and my data are going to be located later. I have the option of changing that by clicking on the gray box next to the directory path. This is so that two different installations of versions don't clobber each other in a production environment. Super important, right? Full disclosure, I went in and deleted those two directories that the installer flagged. Once you have verified or adjusted the installation path, click Next. This is the screen that you might find the most worrisome. It lists all the dependencies, that is operating system files and libraries, that MySQL already expects to see before you actually install anything. MySQL will try to resolve some of these dependencies automatically, and it'll tell you that in the requirements box, like what you're seeing right here. And that's a good thing because of all the components, of course, we want the server, the shell, and the connectors the most. And we can do without the Visual Studio API. The router installation will tag right along as the Visual C++ 2019 library issue gets resolved. As you click Next, you'll see this pop up. Just hit yes and continue. This is where the fun begins, because take a look at this list. What do you see missing? Right, there is no SQL Server on there and no workbench. While you can click on execute and download and install these, you will not have a working installation because, well, you won't have a server. And look at these error messages. But don't panic. Instead, remember the message from the previous screen about Microsoft Visual C++ 2019? We chose to believe the installer that it would find and automatically install this dependency. Obviously, the MySQL installer has failed to find, download, and install that important library. This is why we will close our installer now and hunt for this library. All right, that was frustrating, wasn't it? Maybe we should have read the small print first, or used a pre-built virtual machine. But where's the fun in that? Let's resolve the errors first. Google to the rescue, or Bing, or whatever search engine you prefer. Make sure to download anything only from a Microsoft path to ensure that you're not inviting malicious code into your machine. On the link, scroll down to the download links and then click on the one most appropriate for your computer. As we've seen at the beginning of this video, I'm using a 64-bit computer, so I'm picking the x64 version. All right, library's downloaded. Now I can double-click on it and install. Note that this requires you to have administrator permissions on your machine. This may take a while. So get up and stretch and know that you're almost done. Then come back. Well, now we've closed the MySQL installer, so let's open that back up and see if we can install the server now. That was the purpose of the whole exercise, right? And we're back at the beginning screens to download all our apps. We're still picking the developer default to keep the installation size manageable. And voila, check out the requirements screen now. Remember the long list of unresolved dependencies before we fixed the library error manually? Look at the same window now. The errors are gone. Let's proceed. Once you've reached this screen, you're basically home free. You can see that all the executables are ready to download. That's what we want. If you're on a slower wireless network, now is the time to make yourself a cup of tea, because the download may take a while. Or you can click on Show Details and watch the download log as it builds. You should look at this log anyway, to ensure you catch any problems or start practicing your victory dance. On a weak network, I've seen 1 or 2 modules download and others are out. And then I had to click the back button and forward again to download the others and do that a few times. When you're done, click Next. You may have noticed that all we've done until now is downloading the executables. Now we can actually start installing and configuring them. We have finally reached the actual installer screen. Be sure to check again that MySQL Server and MySQL Workbench are ready to install, and then click on Execute, and you may have guessed it, wait. This is going to take a while, so making yourself a sandwich might be a good idea. If you run into any errors here because you didn't set enough disk space aside, remember that the priority is on MySQL Server and Workbench. The rest is nice to have, but we're not going to sweat that just yet. If you would like to know why the install is taking so long, there's a detail screen again, and you can read along with the installation log as it builds. After all that it took to download the executables, that installation was certainly anticlimactic. But believe me, in IT, you want things to be as uneventful as possible so that you can move on to the actual interesting things. So MySQL is installed now, and the next screen we're seeing is the server configuration screen. Let's take a look at the settings here. I want the config type to be development computer so that MySQL knows to share memory of my laptop with applications like PowerPoint and my web browser. With the tiny databases that will be running in this course, processing speed is not an issue. Next, let's look at the connectivity settings. We see here that the server connects with its clients, such as the command line client, the shell, the workbench, and any other external client you'll want to connect through TCP/IP. The default port number for MySQL is 3306. This means that any hacker looking to mine your database will, of course, attack this port first, especially if the firewall is open as it is here. The best defense is to set the default port number to another number that's not in use. In the real world, you'll have to ask your CISO or your network administrator to assign you one of those. In our classroom world, I have no problem if you leave it at 3306, as long as you know what you're doing. Then let's move on to the next screen. And even more security considerations. We need to determine how we want users to authenticate with our system and how we want to store our passwords. Embarrassingly enough, 256-bit password encryption wasn't really that much of a thing before MySQL 8, and if companies stored important data in their databases like credit card numbers, birth dates, or even more precariously health information, being able to easily decrypt passwords to steal that data was pretty lucrative. With 256-bit encryption and with good user habits to use passphrases instead of passwords, that has become much harder. So we'll leave that as is and move on to setting our super administrator password on the next screen. Just like in Linux, the super administrator account is called root. If a hacker can get their hands on the root password, they can access, create, delete, and modify all data in our database. So don't give them that chance. Pick a passphrase of at least 16 characters instead of a simple password. Introduce some entropy into the spelling or pick a language other than English and go frustrate some hackers. Click Next when you're done. In the real world, you wouldn't give your root password to just anybody only because they want to add a user or a table or a new database to your installation. Instead, you would build a separate account that gives them exactly the permissions that they need in order to do their work, and not more. Here in MySQL, we can follow this principle of least privilege with roles. So if all Sonia here needs to do is to create and reverse engineer database schemas, does she really need DB admin privileges, or are DB designer privileges enough? If we assign Sonia more privileges than she needs, she could, for example, delete users or reset passwords or do other shenanigans that have absolutely nothing to do with database design. We sure don't want that. Once you have created a user that does not have access to your full database functionality, click on Next. Now that you have set up your server's TCP/IP ports, the root accounts, the other accounts, it's time to determine how you want the MySQL Server app to appear in your process table and whether you want MySQL Server to start and run every time you start the computer. Since I usually use my desktop computer to run MySQL, I think I'm going to turn that option off. If you don't have another computer on which you're running MySQL, you may want to keep this option on. Click Next to move to the implementation screen. Then click on Execute and see all your settings being applied. You will most likely have seen the MySQL installer summary at this point, which means that at this time, we're ready to check out whether the installation was successful. Installation verification, sometimes also called post-installation checkout, is the final step in a software installation. Basically, we check if we have all the parts that we need and whether it works. The MySQL installer screen tells us that we have everything installed here that we want, and let's see if that's actually true. First, we check the Windows Start menu. Under MySQL, we see the command line client, which installs with the server, so we know that the server has installed. We also see the shell and the workbench. So it looks like the clients we need in order to interface with the server are all installed here. On the C drive, we need to find the MySQL subdirectories under Program Files and under Program Data. Let's do that next. We're seeing that we have a number of files in the MySQL Server bin subdirectory under Program Files, especially the mysql.exe file, which is the server executable. That looks promising. We also have a number of files and directories in the MySQL Server subdirectory under Program Data. So far, so good. And now comes the big question. Does it run? This is the big moment. Let's see if we can access the sample databases that install with MySQL Server through the command line client. If that works, we know that we've been successful in installing MySQL. So let's pull up the command line client from the Start menu under MySQL. The command line client should open, and once you type in your root password, you should see the MySQL prompt just like what you're seeing here. Awesome! The next step is to type show databases and then a semicolon and the enter key. This will show you the databases that are installed in MySQL. If you've chosen to install the samples as well, you'll see what I'm seeing here. Looking good! Now let's check whether we can get into one of our databases. I'm going to use the Sakila database that came with our samples. So to check out whether I can access it, I type use Sakila semicolon. Once MySQL tells me that the database has been changed, I type show tables semicolon to see the tables inside the database. Now I want to see if I can see the data in any table, so I'm picking the category table and type select star from category. The star is the wildcard here and means everything. And that's what I'm seeing in the output here, the entire content of the table. Yep, that checks out. Well, we know that the command line client can access the server, which means that the server works. But how can we be sure that the server works? We have two options here. We can learn either a whole number of administrative commands from the command line client, or we can try out Workbench and point and click through some administrative GUIs. I don't know about you, but I think at this point we've spent enough time typing, and a quick overview would be great. All right, now let's take a look at the MySQL Workbench in order to see how the server is running. I'm going to my Windows Start menu and I'm scrolling to MySQL. And here I'm finding MySQL Workbench. Now, as I open MySQL Workbench, I'll let you know that there is an option to store the root password. I've already done that, which is why you will not see me enter the root password anymore as I click on this local instance here. So I'm clicking on the local instance and I'm waiting for the GUI to build. And here it is. So we have two tabs, administration and schemas. We're going to look at administration first. Under administration, I have server management options and instance administration options. Instance administration is startup shutdown, is to inspect server logs and to turn server options on and off. That doesn't concern us much, but let's take a look at the server status here. The server status will come up here as a GUI, and we'll see that the server is running and that the performance schema is on, SSL availability is on, and so on and so on. And all of these data here will build over time. As we can see the CPU load here, the connections into the server. And speaking of connections, let's take a look at the client connections that we can see here. These are the 5 client connections that we saw previously. And then we can also look at the users and privileges. We saw that I built the user Sonia here. This is the user Sonia that I've built in the installer. And we can see what the account limits are for the user Sonia. We can see what the administrative roles are for the user Sonia. Remember, she's a DB designer. She is not a DBA, right? So, and here I can point and click to turn these roles on and off and to change them. Here I can see some of my status variables and system variables. That doesn't concern us much, but what does come in handy is the data export when I want to export or back up my database, and the data import, which is when I want to import a database, especially from a self-contained file, which you may need to do sometime during this course. All right, so the next tab that we're looking at is the schemas tab. Here in the schemas, we're seeing our databases. Note that we're seeing only 3 here, Sakila, Sys, and World. In my command line client, I'm seeing 6. I'm seeing the information schema, MySQL, and performance schema, and Sakila, Sys, and World. In the GUI-driven tool here, I am seeing fewer databases than in the command line client. That's because the GUI-driven tool, that is the MySQL workbench, is not really for the super users like the super administrators, but it is for other types of administrators who need to perform actions quickly and who are not as command line driven as the super user. That's also why in this course we'll be working in the command line client more than in the workbench. But the workbench is useful because I can check out my databases with point and click. So here's my Sakila database. I can take a look at the tables here with a little expander, and here's my category table. So in my category table here, I can see the information about the table. And here I can see information about the columns, and I can see the same information right here as well in the little settings icon. And what all that means we'll discuss later. And then I can also see the values that are in this table. And as we see here, that's this. And what you're seeing here is in fact very similar to the command that I typed earlier right here. And the output that we're seeing here is the same output that we're seeing right here. All right, everything checks out, and our database is installed well, and our DBMS works. This is a very good thing. What follows is an installation video on a MacBook Air by Priyansh Yadav. Here you can see his installation process, including the command line work on the terminal in one smooth video. If you're not working on a Mac, feel free to fast forward. Now that wasn't too bad, was it? Let's see what we did. First, we downloaded the installer for the community version from the MySQL website. We opened it and determined the installation dependencies. Then we downloaded the Windows C++ library to resolve the dependency that MySQL wouldn't fix automatically. After that, we downloaded all the installation files and installed the executables. After that, we configured our server with the security settings, including password encryption, root password, and the least privileged user account. And we specified our runtime settings, such as how the server connects to our network and how it should run as a Windows service. Lastly, we performed our installation verification. We first checked that the client executables are available in the Windows Start menu. Then we inspected the MySQL subdirectories under Program Files and Program Data to see if we have the expected files there. Lastly, we accessed the server with the command line client and the workbench and checked out a few system settings, and finally the databases that we could see. And we decided that, yes, the installation was successful. All right, at this point you have learned how to install MySQL on a Windows computer and how to verify your installation. You've also seen a quick installation and checkout on an airbook. Along with that, you have learned the first basic commands to show databases, use a database, show the tables in the database, and select all contents from a table. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in one of the next videos.